Aprimi la camera.
I let them in now.
So welcome everyone to this webinar, the EU Pact on Migration, a new framework for predicting and anticipating crises, organized within the framework of the Horizon 2020 project ITFLOWS. I'm Roberto Cortinovis, researcher at CEPS, and I will be the moderator of this event. Just a few words to introduce the topic of today's discussion. Anticipating and addressing situations defined as migration crisis is one of the pillars of the Pact on Migration and Asylum. In the European Commission's words, the experience of the 2015 refugee crisis shows the lack at the EU level of a structured system to handle situations of crisis and avoid ad hoc responses. To address this need, the Pact put forward two main initiatives. First, a proposal on a crisis and force majeure regulation, which includes a set of rules to be applied when a situation of crisis is established, including specific provisions on solidarity and a set of derogations from normally applicable asylum and return rules. Secondly, a migration preparedness and crisis blueprint in the form of a recommendation which lays down an operational framework for monitoring and anticipating migration situations, together with a toolbox of possible actions to be taken both in member states and third countries to face a situation of crisis. So the elaboration and implementation of this crisis management approach raises several relevant questions, both with regard to how the experience of the 2015 refugee crisis has been incorporated into current initiatives, but also about the role that this policy framework could play in addressing ongoing situations, such as the one currently unfolding at the EU eastern border with Belarus. So some of the questions that we are going to address today. To start with, what is a migration crisis and how the existence of such a situation should be established? What is the process? And what are the criteria and indicators that need to be considered? And secondly, in light of the focus on crisis anticipation in the Pact, what are the strengths and limitations of existing models and tools to monitor and predict migration dynamics? And also, what are the ethical and legal dilemmas that are raised by these predictive tools? Finally, does the proposed crisis management approach ensure adequate safeguards for the fundamental rights of individuals and compliance with EU legal standards in the field of asylum? So we are going to address these and other questions with a panel of experts, which includes policymakers, academics, representatives of human rights and humanitarian organizations. We are very pleased to have with us today Mr. Juan Fernando López Aguilar, Chair of the LIBE Committee of the European Parliament and Rapporteur on the Commission proposal on a crisis and force majeure regulation. We will then hear from Mr. Paweł Buziakiewicz from the European Commission, DG Home Affairs and Migration, head of the unit responsible for situational awareness. After that, we will have two interventions from academic experts. Anne Singleton, reader in migration policy at Bristol University in the UK, and Giuseppe Campesi, professor at the University of Bari in Italy. I have to inform you that unfortunately Professor Henk van Houten from Radboud University in the Netherlands, who is listed among the speakers, could unfortunately not join us today due to an health issue. After this set of interventions, I will give the floor to our two discussants for their comments and observation on the previous interventions in light of their specific experience. We are very grateful for joining us today to Annalise Baldaccini, Executive Officer on Asylum and Migration at Amnesty International, and Paola Maielli, Program Coordinator of the migration response at the Italian Red Cross. Finally, after the discussion, Professor Sergio Carrera, senior researcher at CEPS, will also provide a set of concluding remarks. As usual, we envisage an interactive discussion with the audience, and in view of this, I would like to invite you to use the Q&A tool and specify to whom of our speakers you would like to address your questions. Just a final note on time management. I would kindly remind our speakers to try to keep their intervention to their indicated time, allocated time of 10 minutes. So now, without any further ado, I would like to turn to our first speaker, Mr. Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar. We are very interested to hear your views on the topic of this webinar, especially in relation to the proposal on a crisis and force majeure regulation in light of your role as rapporteur on that file. Mr. Lopez Aguilar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you again. And good morning to you all. Good day. Pleasure to be with you. Pleasure to have a part in this open conversation on matters of our common interests, and willing to see you personally anytime soon back in the podium of the Committee of Liberty, Justice and Home Affairs, dealing with this new Migration and Asylum Pact, which is yet to deliver. You know how I feel about this whole thing. I always insist that this proposal by the Commission, consisting of 5 pieces of legislation, proposed pieces of legislations, all of them regulations, is not intended to fill a void or a gap, because there is no such thing. We have put in place a migration package consisting of at least 8 pieces of legislation which are already effective and in force, and we have put in place, as to the asylum package, 9 pieces of legislation. And yes, the actual delivery and the implementation of those pieces of legislation has been subject to much criticism. And this is why we understand that it's about time that we reckon we give account of the gap between the legislation and its implementation, the gap between what we might call the European state of mind and the European actual action. And this is why we are taking seriously this window of opportunity to improve the situation by this legislative procedure, which is now underway. And I am the rapporteur of the crisis regulation, which is relevant because it's meant to set a regime for exceptional situations on a so-called imminent risk of mass influx of third country nationals or stateless persons arriving irregularly in a member state. And I add, this is a contribution that I'm intending to make, or disembarking in the member states following search and rescue interventions. So a link between the situation of mass influx of third country nationals or stateless persons arriving irregularly with disembarkment following search and rescue interventions, because that is for sure the situation which is more likely to take place in the so-called southern external border of the European Union, the so-called vulnerable external border of the European Union, namely those countries leaning to the Mediterranean: Greece, Cyprus, Malta, Italy, and Spain. Spain including also the Atlantic in the Canaries, which continues to be the most perilous route, migratory route to the European Union, with the highest death toll, which is only increasing by the day. It is kind of a sad irony that for the past few weeks, this situation, which is still ongoing in the Canaries, has somehow been taken out of sight or withered away by the volcano emergency in La Palma, which is headlines all across Europe, the headlines in the world, but it's still ongoing. Every day we have 200, 100, 200, 100 people rescued in the seas to the Canaries, and with a high casualty death toll. Every day we have to regret that there are 8 or 7 casualties in every search and rescue operation, including kids, women, extremely vulnerable persons who tried to make it to the Canaries and hence to the European Union, but couldn't make it. Finally, couldn't make it. But the point of this crisis regulation is that these assumptions, these facts, these factual assumptions, imminent risk of mass influx and disembarking following search and rescue operations, are to follow in a scale or nature that makes asylum reception, that means the so-called common European asylum system, non-functional. The main points that I'm intending to make, and I'm presenting my report just this Thursday before the LIBE committee, I am presenting my draft report to open up the deadline for tabling amendments. The main points that I'm intending to make would be as follows. First, as to the definitions, as to the so-called concepts, the definitions. Definition of crisis. It has to include the evacuation programs that we have seen in the Afghan situation, taking advantage of this Afghan state of mind that has all of a sudden taken place in the European Parliament, and I would say in the European decision making, because the evacuation programs need to be accompanied with measures to follow the evacuation. Humanitarian visas, humanitarian corridors are to serve the purpose of direct evacuations. And those evacuation programs should be a part of a response to unpredicted emergencies. We need clear parameters to establish the crisis. So the crisis has to be better defined as to the risk that the crisis will result in adverse effects in the interests of the applicants or arriving persons, and the risk that member states cannot cope with its civil obligations under EU law no more. And then there comes the so-called concept of force majeure, which is somehow extravagant to the philosophy of the crisis regulation, because force majeure is a clause that is meant to make exceptions to the fulfillment or compliance with contract law, not in this matter of migratory situations. So we propose that force majeure will be included in the crisis concept, will be somehow incorporated into the crisis concept, so that it'll be refined not only in the recitals, but also in the wording of the articles, so that force majeure is an element, a component element of the crisis situation, which is unpredictable and unforeseeable. Then we make a point of the consequences of crisis and force majeure under better governance. That means that the European Commission will need to use delegated acts for its decisions and reports. Second, that the European Parliament and the Council, as co-legislators, can also ask the European Commission to initiate an assessment to see if a member state is actually under a crisis situation. Third, the crisis assessment must rely on information provided by agencies, Fundamental Rights Agency, EASO, which is turned out to be now an asylum agency, fully fledged asylum agency, and also Frontex, but also of international organizations, including UNHCR and the International Organization for Migrations. Fourth, the European Commission shall determine how many relocations need to be done via delegated acts. And relocation will be, for sure, the main instrument to serve the purpose of solidarity, which is mandated in Article 80 of the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union. Solidarity must be implemented via relocations, and persons eligible for relocations are the following: all applicants, included in the border procedure or not, and beneficiaries as well. In the relocation procedures, there are some categories of persons that should be prioritized: unaccompanied minors, vulnerable persons, and prima facie beneficiaries of international protection. Those categories of persons should be prioritized when it comes to relocation procedure. If member states do not meet the number of relocations which are required, the European Commission shall adjust their contributions on the basis of a distribution key. Which are the parameters for that distribution key? GDP, size population, and employment rate. And we can also consider the number or rate of international protection or humanitarian protection that have been granted by that particular member state to be a part of a distribution key to be a component element of the relocation scheme. And finally, we will ask the European Commission to appoint a European Union relocation coordinator, someone responsible to provide added value and to monitor and to complement the efforts of member states to implement the relocation programs. Final point on the consequences of the situation of crisis. First, we are well aware that the registration period can be extended. And we mean that it should be extended until 3 weeks after making of the application. This should be for a very limited period of time in order to allow for the member states to get its staffed resources organized, possibly with the help of EASO, the Agency for Asylum. And there's the need to apply immediately the Reception Conditions Directive after the making of the application. Then there has to be a mandatory relocation scheme in place. That is the main goal of my report in the crisis regulation. And there has to be an emphasis on prima facie recognition of those categories of persons which suggest a well-founded application for the asylum procedures qualification. All those persons which are in a situation of well-funded, notably, visibly well-funded claim for some sort of international protection should be granted a prioritized procedure under the prima facie recognition. That means particular groups, nationalities, or region of applicants, regardless of the type of protection, be it refugee status or be it subsidiary protection, in a very short timeline for the completion of the procedure. And a final point I would make is that I think it is about time that we repeal the Temporary Protection Directive with this regulation, with this crisis regulation, because it doesn't make sense no more. Crisis regulation is meant to be a remedy, should be efficient and tangible enough to trigger the corresponding mechanism, allowing for extended, genuine, and practical solidarity, more robust than we have seen so far. And it's been 20 years that the Temporary Protection Directive have been in place with no results, with no implementation, with no actual situation in which it can be implemented. In conclusion, we try to overcome the current ambiguity of overlapping derogation regimes while reinforcing this instrument, the crisis regulation, in accordance and respect with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, Article 18 and 19, which forbids collective expulsions, by the way, which means forbids pushbacks, which are illegal under European law, highlighting the need to make solidarity a reality, as it's stated in Article 80 of the Treaty of Functioning of European Union, incorporating some of the so-called blueprint preparedness dispositions, which are in the blueprint of the proposal by the Commission, so that we can give account of a new architecture in which solidarity might be given a chance to be taken seriously. Those are the main points that I'm intending to share with the committee I chair the Libe session we're having this Thursday, and opening, of course, the timeline for amendments. But I conclude by putting it frankly and I would say even bluntly that the situation is dire. It's not going to be an easy task to get this package approach respected and to get this improvement achieved. It's going to be tough. It's not impossible. It's going to be difficult, but not impossible. And believe me, I'm going to try. We're going to try. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed, Mr. Lopez Aguilar, for your intervention, for guiding us through what are the key issues and indeed the amendments that will be included in the report. And we look forward to reading in detail this report. You mentioned several relevant points. I just recall here the overall approach, the overall philosophy of your report that you mentioned at the beginning, which is the focus on reducing loss of life at the border, and reducing the adverse effect also for individuals when a situation of crisis or emergency is declared. So many thanks again. I would like to inform our audience that Mr. Lopez Aguilar will have to leave us after his intervention due to another commitment. But once again, many thanks for being with us today and for your contribution. So I turn now to our second speaker, Mr. Pavel Buziakiewicz from the Commission Directorate General of Home Affairs. Because indeed, beside this legislative side that was the object of the previous intervention, there is also an important operational dimension in the Pact, which is laid down in the Migration, Preparedness and Crisis blueprint, whereby the Commission is also focusing specifically on anticipating migration situation, not only to respond to this. So we are very interested to hear from Mr. Pavel Buziakiewicz the state of play and which are the initiatives that the Commission is currently focusing on in the current context. Mr. Buziakiewicz, I give you the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this event, which will be surely very useful also for the work of my unit. Let me introduce myself. My name is Pablo Shakib. I'm head of Situational Awareness Unit in the Director General for Home Affairs. And we indeed look, well, as our title says, we look in particular on what is happening across the EU in a comprehensive way in terms of the flows. And we try to make the adequate basis, factual basis for any decisions which are linked to migration management nowadays at the EU level. And I will indeed focus on the blueprint, which is an instrument which we developed and we manage in my unit, which will, I think, well complement of what we have heard at the level of policy and proposals from Mr. Aguilar. Now, the starting point, I will give three kind of layers, a little bit of a starting point. Where did we come from? What do we do now? And what are the possible next developments and next steps? So the starting point for us, for Blueprint, was basically experiences from 2015. And in 2015, 2016, Crisis did expose several gaps on our side in terms of migration management, and especially on the operational side. I mean, we discovered that, well, we have agencies, but maybe Commission is focused much more on the political side, policy making side, instead of and not so much on the operational side, which was pretty natural at that time, you know, looking even beyond earlier than 2015. But all this had to change if we were to be responsive in such situations. we discovered that the starting point actually is lacking situational awareness, lacking knowing really comprehensively what is going on. Because even while having agencies and member states being deployed according to their mandates, it was very important to bring all that together and compose a good complete picture on how many people arrived, how many people are asking for asylum, what do we do in terms of funding, what do we do in terms of response in the ground, deployments, reception situation, etc. And that was actually the starting point of the construction of the blueprint. And luckily, I must say, on the beginning we were maybe we had a little bit more of ambitions to have a firmer legal basis. But I must say that luckily we chose a light form, which is a Commission recommendation, which allowed us basically to start work and develop further work from day one. We didn't have to wait for negotiations, which very much impact the entry into force of particular elements of the pact. And I think that it was definitely our strength. Obviously, we didn't start from zero. We did base ourselves on things that we have developed, but Blueprint allowed us to a little bit consolidate what we have reached so far. So you will see that we are operating with 2 stages of the Blueprint, but at the core of it is the network where we exchange information, where we bring all the actors, all the agencies, including FRA, EULISA, Europol, EASO, Frontex, etc. We bring EAS also with the delegations. We have also a network of MLOs across the world, so we also use their expertise here. Obviously, member states, but we also are able on a needs basis to reach out to international organizations and other actors and to third countries. We haven't done so far, we haven't reached to third countries yet, but definitely there is basically is to say that it's a very flexible also mechanism which is necessary during the crisis, because not the crisis have one thing that they have in common is that they are not so much one alike the other. I mean, we have seen the crisis 2015. Now we have another problem at the border with Belarus. So we have seen a lot of phases of the crisis or an alarming situation. Let's put it that way. Now, so this is what we do, and what we have focused is to establish a well-functioning network, which with the main objective actually is, as I said, it's not policy making, it's not even so much decision making. It's to bring all the information in maybe not real time, but very accurate and timely manner, and to provide the basis for policymakers to make their decisions in an educated, if you wish, way. Obviously, you will see that also in the Blueprint recommendations, you have also a list of tools that we have listed that are basically at our disposal, but obviously it's not for Blueprint to take decisions on many of those measures, but they are more of a toolbox that we should bear in mind while eventually analyzing this or another situation. And this brings me to the point on what we do now, and what we do now is very much looking at Afghanistan and at what is happening in Belarus with this idea of first of all providing the timely information, but also, especially when we talk about Afghanistan, is also to try to anticipate and to look what is going on in Afghanistan, how the situation can further evolve, how it can then further impact, obviously in a kind of domino effect, as it usually happens, further on toward the EU, in order to be better prepared. On the other hand, we also keep in touch with agency and member states and keep discussing on their measures of preparedness, how they feel about their contingency measures, contingency abilities, and capacities. So that is what we are doing, and this work is very intensive, especially in terms of monitoring, because we do it basically on a weekly basis. But of course, the more you accumulate and you more you consolidate in terms of situational awareness, the more you will face expectations on, yeah, well, now please look at what is coming next, how we could better prepare, etc. And that is what we definitely look very closely. I cannot say that we are very mature there, but surely it is one of our main points of the agenda for further developments. And in a way, you know, a starting point, if you have a good situation awareness, and I'm talking not only about the EU but also about third countries, this is already a first step to have a proper understanding what might come up. And this is definitely what we do already now. We look closely at main countries of origin, of transit, with all the networks that we have, including agencies, liaison officers, delegations, European migration liaison officers, to little bit map what is the situation in those third countries and what can come up. And here again, example, as I said, very much is Afghanistan, but it's not. I mean, we are doing similar things, maybe not so intensively, but for other main countries of origin and transit. And then building on that, maybe I wouldn't call it forecasting, because forecasting is a little bit of might be a trap, but and might not be really possible for migration. But surely an early warning kind of mechanism should be elaborated. Basically, trying to have certain key indicators, especially for third countries, which in case they basically go beyond the thresholds, whatever threshold we might set there, and they might be different according to a country, because I mean, economic threshold or political stability threshold is not really universal everywhere. Then once certain of those indicators they start going beyond the thresholds, well, definitely that would be at least a solid early warning mechanism, saying, well, be careful, because then you might face, according to the numbers accumulated on this or another route, migratory route, you might face this or another situation. So this is one layer of this forecasting or early warning preparedness. Then the other layer is, of course, more on internal side, and then looking at what member states and agencies are in what position they are, in what capacity they have. This is even more, let's say, challenging, because there are certain issues that, of course, are within the remit of agencies, and agencies are doing a lot of work here. And of course, member states were, for some of them at least, certain of that information is still a matter of their own competences. Well, lastly, it will be natural that the more we will advance in that work, the more facilitating tools would be used. So I'm talking here about any machine learning or artificial intelligence tools, big data usage, etc. Of course, within the limit of the legal framework, and bearing in mind that, I mean, it's not, I mean, just because we would use a tool, this or another decision, human decisions would be replaced. So this is clear that this would be in any case only an assistance for analysts to make a proper meaning of for the situation. And last but not least, let's not forget that not everything can be foreseen. I mean, as much as we would be thinking a lot about Belarus last year, no one would bring that type of scenario. What we were actually rather looking at is possible outflow of Belarusian citizens coming to the EU due to the regime persecutions, then bringing proactively people from across the world, and bringing them directly at the border. So, voila, that's where we are, and toward where we would be evolved. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Buzakiewicz, for your intervention, and I think and for providing this overview and description of the activities in which this blueprint is already currently being used. I think some of the aspects you mentioned also links in a number of ways with the research agenda and with the objectives of ITFLOWS, even if of course there are different objectives and priorities. But yeah, I think it's very relevant to understand how then these tools, early warning forecasting tools, to the extent possible, are used and can be applied in real life situations. So thanks a lot again, and I think these two interventions really provide a good overview of the state of play and initiatives under the Pact and the priorities and concerns of key institutions, the Parliament and the Commission. And so it paves the way very well to the contribution from our academic experts. So our next speaker is Anne Singleton from Bristol University. So Anne, you have worked extensively on data and statistics on a wide range of migration-related aspects. So you're very well placed to give us some insights on what are the issues and gaps concerning data collection, which are crucial also for all the instruments that we are discussing, and what are the priorities for improving the quality of data and their use for policymaking. Anne, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to only speak about what to do about filling data gaps, because I've been involved for nearly a quarter of a century now on work improving data quality, and under the assumption that I started off with, that improving data might lead to better policy. And I'm led to thinking now, will this discussion go round in circles for another 25 years, where policy actually doesn't seem to learn from the evidence in front of everyone? There's plenty of evidence now on public data portals, the IOM's migration data portal. The European Commission has its own public interface between the public and presenting data. And there's been a lot of work done on attempting to forecast and predict what might be happening in terms of migration. There are three main categories you could look at, if you see on the data portal, of the way in which predictions or forecasting might be approached. We have early warning systems, which are described as relying on quantitative and qualitative data, and looking at what's described as monitoring potential drivers and movements of populations in real time. That's the work of Karamia and Dumont, presented on portal. My question there is, it depends, the early warning systems depend on your choice of data, if the data are available. Another form is to look at migration forecasting, where you attempt to predict future migration flows and trends using quantitative modelling methods. And again, I would question there that depends on your choice of model and the data that you put into the model. And then there's the approach of Foresight, which is outlined by Hein de Haas and others, looking at qualitative scenario methods, which relies typically developing the work from a group of experts engaging in systematic group discussions. My question there would be your choice of expert. So all of these different approaches did not manage to predict what happened with the collapse of Yugoslavia, with the temporary protection measures that were never introduced, never applied. We haven't been able to, no one was able to predict what happened with the pandemic, with COVID-19. And what seems to be never to be factored in is how predicting and responding to crisis, which is produced by policy, is possible if you don't factor into the predictive model the very policy that is helping to produce the crisis. So this whole negative framing of looking at what's happening with migration is part of the problem. The negative framing, the creation of the policy issues continually as being migration crisis or policy crisis or humanitarian crisis, instead of looking at the policy roots of crisis migration. So there's an asymmetry between the relative ease with which crises can be generated, whether by design. We could argue that might be Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, Russia in the background, with Turkey, Libya, with criminal intent, what happened in the Balkans and Syria, or could it be negligence or abdication of duty? Could it be by accident? So how is it possible to discuss all of this, the scenarios and the forecasting, without having the input in an open and transparent way from the policymakers involved in this very securitization of the borders and presenting human movements as a crisis in themselves, which is somehow unconnected with the European Union's policies, unconnected with the Pact. So we could spend a lot of time looking at new data sources, at big data. We could look at all the different possible methods of clever techniques and modelling. But there's a vacuum in the policy discussions at the level of the moral and ethical issues that need addressing about why the movement of people moving from desperate situations is presented as a crisis for states, in which solidarity needs to be organised with solidarity between states rather than human solidarity with human beings. So I think there's a problem there that in somehow following the same approach, both in policy terms and improving data, is going to lead to the same results. We know from the missing migrants database, we know how much is, in a way, is not known about how many people died, but it's certainly much more on the record how many people are known to have died either on land or in the sea, moving towards safer conditions for their own lives or to try and meet their own aspirations. And the way in which that is not informing any better framing of policy is quite alarming to many of us in many different academic fields as well as different policy fields. So my argument would be, yes, we do need to see better quality data, but in one sense, the data that you look at are in part and to a large extent a product of the questions that you ask and the political priorities that you have. So if we wanted to know how many people are being harmed and what could be done to stop people being harmed, you might take a different approach rather than looking at security focused crisis narratives about what's happening at the border. So my contribution here really is really a plea to kind of move the framing of the debate away from being entirely about crisis management and to look at what the contribution of the policies that are in place, what that contribution is to producing a scenario in which which policymakers only see crisis. So the bullet points I would suggest that we need to look at is how modelling should include different ways of understanding why people make decisions, how state policies interact at the interface with people's individual lives and how people negotiate moving to safer or more harmonious situations to live in. The focus on data quality, which is important, should not be deemed to replace the need for effective and humane policy-making decisions which are done in a transparent way. The assumptions behind many of the models and the modelling now still rely on what's really derived from the old push-pull approach to what's now called drivers of migration, but there's a lot of academic work that can help to inform how it may be possible to better understand the dynamics of migration flows, including who is not visible in the data, and that's where many of the policy gaps lie, whether it be with children, as we saw yesterday, the launch of a report, a UNICEF and report for IDAC, for the committee looking at improving data on children during forced migration and migration movements. That should be a priority for if you can protect children, then presumably you're going to be protecting human beings of all ages. So the underlying assumptions around push-pull and drivers have led to a dominance of economic factors and a determinism in the way in which policy is assumed to need certain types of data and not to need other data. Very often there have been attempts to improve forecasting by using the Delphi method. Very often this includes experts, but not the experts who are migrants and the experiences and views. There are many complexities in the social economic context which are not taken into account. Big data in itself, big data is not the answer. Big data might help to give some notion about pictures of what's happening with human mobility. That's not, you need a lot more than that in order to decide about policy. And all of the above do not factor in the known policy direction and impacts of the European Union, of the Pact, the member states' border and foreign policies, and the way in which the political use of migrants is avoided in all of this modelling. Somehow there's an innocence to the modelling that seems to ignore the political realities of what's happening, which are then taken up in terms of security priorities. There's an avoidance of monitoring the effects and the impacts of policies, the responsibility of the European Union institutions to monitor the effects of what happens when these policies are put into practice. I think there's very often a poor understanding of the link between policy and practice and the actions at the borders. And as a result, we see almost now what's seen as a normalization of deaths, that deaths are taken as a normal part, deaths at the border, normal part of so-called migration management. Even if it's seen as a failure, in some ways, it seems to be factored in to the way in which the European Union and member states are approaching management of the borders. And this use of people as weapons, the whole language is just shocking, is frightening. We heard the word crisis at the beginning of this webinar. I started counting, I gave up after about the 20th time the word crisis was used. We need to step back and have a rational discussion that places ethics and human values at the centre. And whilst the security of the borders involves criminalisation of people who are trying to save lives, I think we really do have an ethical crisis at the heart of the European Union. So my plea would be, in thinking about forecasting and thinking about predicting what's going to happen, we need to have an honest inclusion of what's actually being decided and included in the EU's policies, and an honest assessment that the result of this is going to be more of the same unless a different approach is taken. So thank you. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Many thanks, Anne, for your great intervention, and indeed for highlighting some indeed crucial issues that need to be considered, and that we also wanted to highlight in this debate. So an over reliance on tools and on methods to monitor and improve data collection is not in itself something that can avoid focusing on what are the underlying purposes and objectives. And indeed, this is a key question, and the unfolding of different crises, the fact that one crisis just happened after the other in the last few years is I think the most relevant development that should make us think much more carefully about all the aspects and the points that you have raised. So many thanks again, and I think there will be further possibilities during the discussion to address in more details the aspects that you have raised. I would like now to turn to our next speaker, Giuseppe Campesi from Bari University. So Giuseppe, in your research, you have focused, among other things, on the study of border control policies, migration management policies along the EU external frontiers, and we have focused specifically on how situations are framed as emergencies and how then specific policies are adopted to respond to these situations constructed as emergency. So in the previous years, over the previous years, we have also seen the multiplication of different actors at the EU level dealing with monitoring, risk analysis, assessment of member states' vulnerabilities and capacity to react to different migration situations. EU agencies have acquired or are in the process of acquiring an important role here. So we are very interested to hear your thoughts on how this composite policy landscape is evolving in light of the Pact, and in light that, as Anne was also mentioning, the Pact has also a focus on monitoring, at the border and monitoring of different policies that are implemented. Giuseppe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
And clear.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Yes, as we said since the beginning, the new pact includes the proposal for a new, let's say, crisis response mechanism. What I mean by crisis response mechanism is a set of forecasting or foresight or predictive instruments, and a set of response tools, including rules for derogating to ordinary procedures in certain circumstances, specific measures which can be adopted when a crisis erupts, so on and so forth. Interestingly, EU Migration and Asylum law actually was not devoid of crisis response mechanisms, and therefore the new pact, if adopted, will add a set of new instruments to the already existing one. So my objective today is twofold. So I will try to map the existing crisis response mechanisms, briefly, of course, in EU Migration and Asylum law. And then, probably most importantly, I will try to understand what counts as a crisis. We were speaking about crisis a lot today, so but we never defined what counts as a crisis in EU Migration and Asylum law, actually. So what is the legal definition of crisis according to the EU legal framework? Because of course, you know, much of the functioning of every crisis response mechanism depends on how you define the crisis, how you define the crisis. So to start with the mapping exercise, I will try to be brief here, you know, just provide you with a quick sketch. Well, a first set of provisions are those included in, for instance, in Article 78, paragraph 3 of the Treaty on the Function of the European Union, Article 18 on the Return Directive, Article 31, paragraph 3 of the Directive on Common Procedures. All those provisions envisage the possibility to derogate from ordinary return asylum procedures or to trigger solidarity mechanisms in exceptional circumstances. Another set of provisions are those included in the Dublin III regulation and in the Schengen evaluation system. Here we have the first embryo, if you want, of a forecasting tool, of a predictive tool with EU agencies, Frontex and EASO, involved in monitoring, assessing the implementation of EU policies and law. But the response tools which were envisaged at the time were weak in many ways. You know, when a problem arises, the only response which is possible according to those instruments is inviting member states to adopt a plan. This is the Dublin regulation, for instance, or informing the Council and the Parliament, the Schengen evaluation mechanisms. Then we had a more elaborated set of crisis response mechanisms. In particular, I'm referring here to that which is included in the regulation on the European Border Coast Guard. And also the one which is included in the proposal on the EU Asylum Agency, which mirrors the instruments implemented with the regulation on Frontex. According to these instruments, EU agencies are called to perform complex risk assessment, monitoring. For instance, Frontex may assign a different level of impacts, risk impacts to different sections of the border. So there is a complex predictive instruments at work here. And there are also a set of very articulate operational crisis response tools, operational crisis response tools. The hotspot approach was one of them, actually an operational response tool, in order to offer support to member states facing a crisis at their borders. So what the pact will add to this picture is a set of rules for adapting pre-entry procedures in exceptional situations, specific solidarity regimes for offering support to member states facing exceptional challenges, and a new instrument for offering immediate protection in exceptional situations. A major change will also be the pivotal role that the Commission will be called to perform in monitoring migration trends and member state preparedness, and deciding, in particular, when a situation of crisis may be declared and the appropriate response to that situation. So if the pact is approved, EU Migration and Asylum law will have at least 6 different definitions of what counts as a crisis or exceptional situation in migration and asylum management. Besides the definitions included in other instruments, the Schengen evaluation mechanisms, Frontex regulation, EU Asylum Agency proposal on the EU Asylum Agency regulation, we will have the definitions included in the pact, namely the definition of force majeure, which may trigger adaptations to border and asylum return procedures, the definition of migratory pressure, which may trigger a specific solidarity regime, and the definition of crisis situation, again, triggering adaptations to procedures, so a specific peculiar solidarity regimes for crisis situations, and eventually the activation of the immediate protection instrument. So I think there is nothing more to say here on the unnecessary complexity of a multi-layered crisis response mechanisms, which is based on 6 different definitions of what counts as a crisis, according to EU law. I want just to conclude with some remarks on the way in which what is a crisis. What a crisis is actually defined in existing and proposed legal instruments. Interestingly, some instruments seem to offer a more quantitative or quantifiable definition of crisis. They speak of sudden inflow of third country nationals. This is the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Exceptionally large number of third country nationals. This is the Return Directive. Large number of applications. This is the Directive on Common Procedures, Asylum Procedures. And finally, the definition of migratory pressure included in the pact. Large number of arrivals. So these instruments seems to suggest that crises are mostly related with sudden and exceptional changes in migratory trends, change in the numbers. However, on the other instruments offer a more complex definition of crisis, seen as a kind of combination of 2 dimensions, 2 main factors. A disproportionate challenge or pressure, I'm quoting actually the very words used by those instruments. So a disproportionate challenge or pressure faced by a member state's border control or asylum system, coupled with an inadequate implementation of EU and asylum law. So if we take the definitions included in the Schengen evaluation mechanisms, in the Frontex regulation, in the proposal on the EU Asylum Agency, but also the definition of crisis situation included in the pact, we see that crisis is mostly defined in relation with the functionality of member states' migration and asylum systems. So according to my opinion, and I'm about to conclude here, defining a crisis in these terms is problematic on different grounds. First, what counts as a crisis is highly dependent on the assessment of the infrastructural capacities of the member state concerned. And this is hardly an objective assessment, given the political sensitivities of the issue. Secondly, this also means, and here I'm really on the same page with Professor Singleton, this also means admitting that crises are to a large extent manufactured by member states' action or inaction, are related with policies, with the way in which policies are implemented. So not just migratory trends. You cannot quantify in the indicators and forecast a potential crisis, because much depends on the way in which policies are implemented. So much depends on policies decisions. And finally, starting from a definition of crisis made in these terms, crisis response mechanisms are activated only on condition that the crisis may have an impact on the functioning of the system. So what is to be protected is the functioning of the system, not human security of migrants and asylum seekers, which is not of concern. For instance, immediate protection may be activated only when there is the risk that the asylum system of one member state may become non-functional, not when you have the need to offer protection, people fleeing war or other political turmoils, but only on condition that our asylum system is becoming non-functional. So I think this is highly problematic definition of crisis from a ethical, political, and legal point of view, if you want. And I think I may stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Giuseppe. And it's very interesting. And I think this detailed also description of how these different concepts of crisis, which are used and are part of the activities of different actors, it's also relevant. But as you mentioned in the last part of your intervention, there are some underlying assumptions which are controversial and which that they need to be part of this debate when discussing how this crisis management, or even the use and the reliance of the notion of crisis in itself is part of the policy responses and the role it plays also in the range of available policy responses. So many thanks again. I think it's now time to turn to our discussants. I think during the previous interventions, really a range of very relevant issues touching upon a number of aspects, legal, political, and operational, have been raised. And we are very pleased to have the opportunity to listen from a representative from organizations, human rights, humanitarian organizations that indeed play both a key role to support people on the ground at the border and also within the member states, but as also the experience shows, they also play a crucial role as knowledge producers. So in shedding light, in bringing relevant evidence, and also in giving bringing additional evidence, and also in shedding light on aspects that may not be part of other of institutional or formal monitoring mechanisms. So I would like to give the floor to our first discussant, Annalise Baldaccini from Amnesty International. The floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm very, very pleased to be here with you today, and I would like to thank again the organizers of this event for having invited me to be a discussant. I must say the input from the previous speakers has been absolutely great, and there's a lot of food for thought, I must say. Starting with the contribution by the MEP Lopez Aguilar, it is reassuring to understand from him the direction in which he's taking the proposed crisis regulation. It is reassuring to hear that there is a sense at which the input from the committee, the rapporteurs and the shadows received from various experts. In this case, I must say that they did rely on to some, or he did rely in any instance to a great extent to the evidence that was provided in the course of the consultations with civil society organizations and with other experts, including academic experts, but it was a wide range of consultations seem to have been taken into account. There is it's important to hear particularly that there is an insistence on the fact that there will be no legal vacuum in a situation of let's so-called crisis. That there is insistence on reception conditions being applicable, because in situations where registrations of applicants, of asylum applicants, might have to be registration deadlines might have to be extended, and that is already allowed under the current acquis. It is important that this does not lead to a situation where migrants are asylum seekers are exposed to risks of detention, deportation, refoulement, or their rights to adequate reception, information, and legal assistance and basic services is denied. This is not what we would want to happen in any situation, such as in a current scenario where Afghan refugees would present themselves in a larger influx at the borders of Europe spontaneously, and they would have to be registration deadlines, extension of the registration would have to be allowed, and then we would find ourselves in a situation where it is legally possible to keep them in a sort of legal limbo. And that is what I think MEP Lopez Aguilar is trying to prevent. I also like the emphasis on prima facie recognition, because it is very likely that in a situation of crisis in a country from which asylum seekers and refugees are coming from, these would be very likely to be prima facie refugees. So to avoid administrative making administrative procedures cumbersome, it is better to allow access to full protection status. And the experience of the Syrian refugee crisis in that respect is very telling, because when the arrivals of great numbers of Syrians happened in those years, particularly to Germany through the Balkan route, as we know, the German approach was very telling. It was they did recognize refugee status to Syrians. And then when the status was reviewed 3 years later, nearly all of them, 99.8%, had their status confirmed. So the approach that the German administration then took was that of a real grant of immediate status because of recognition that these were prima facie refugees. This is currently not reflected in the crisis proposed crisis regulation. With regards to the contribution from Pavel Busiakiewicz, there is it is to some extent he confirmed what we had already heard, that the current blueprint, I mean the two crises, so to say, and I do apologize to Anne Singleton, the current situations that which the EU perceives, EU institutions, particularly in member states, perceive as a qualify as a crisis, but are to no extent a crisis as such, are currently being steered, the action in respect to what, and I'm referring here to the Afghan situation and the situation at the borders with Belarus, are currently being steered by the crisis management tools already available, and one of which is the Council's integrated political crisis response and the Migration Blueprint Networks meeting. So this is a mechanism that is already in action, and which is already steering responses to those situations. Now, the way this is being steered is what is problematic, and here again, this falls very neatly within Anne Singleton's contribution. What is driving EU action is basically curtailing migration at any cost and not so much governing it. This is the problem that underlies the policy responses to situations that are being which have a massive human cost on people mainly. Then I am again, I do agree that there is a crisis, an ethical crisis, more than at the heart of European, more than a migration crisis, as well as a crisis of implementation of what is the current asylum acquis, which perhaps again reflects the fact, the ethical crisis. There is, and this is one of the reasons organizations such as Amnesty International, but others as well, insist so much on the fact that what is really needed is that policies are being driven, or the policies' impact is being assessed, and that they are being driven by, they are being preceded by what we call due diligence processes that have that result in taking into account what we say impact they might have, and that this is then taking into account to further tailor policies and ensure that they are compliant with the treaties, with fundamental rights values, and so on. This is not what is happening. I mean, there is a general way of proceeding in a very cynical way, I would say. And when you see about the policies that are currently being implemented in the Central Mediterranean, it's a very cynical way of proceeding. On the narrative is one of human life saving, but what ultimately the result is, again, that is the open narrative, but the underlying drive is again the prevention of migration and the curtailing of arrivals to Europe, which then result in people being pulled back by what we know, what is called the Libyan Coast Guard, and then people, those who are intercepted and brought back, languishing in terrible conditions in the Libyan detention centers. And this is a policy that is reinforced by the very actions that the EU is implementing and taking. So we have really, I think, experts, academics, civil society organizations, everyone involved needs to insist on the monitoring, on the need for impact assessments, and on these parts of the policy-making cycle being fully brought in and given due account and consideration. I don't know if I have a bit more time. I wanted just to refer to the fact that the EU, I totally agree with Giuseppe Campesi's point about the fact that the EU asylum and migration system was not devoid of any crisis response mechanism. He has listed what all the derogations already allowed in the EU acquis, the crisis response mechanism and tools already available. And again, here policymakers should firstly look at for instance, the European impact assessment, horizontal impact assessment that has pretty much pointed, for example, to this staff working paper presenting the pact, where it is obvious that no clear-cut case has been made for the additional instruments that are being put forward. And then in terms of derogations and so on, the Commission itself had until in relation to the Hungarian derogations argued in court that the crisis, those types of crises the Hungarian allegedly were dealing with, could have been resolved within the existing derogations and within existing rules under the EU acquis, and didn't need to recur to declarations of emergencies or other derogations. So again, there was a line of thinking that for some reason had changed in a second time, or the pact is being driven by other considerations and we don't know exactly what these are. I think I have exhausted my time.
Thanks a lot, Annalise, for your very rich contributions. A lot of things also for our speakers to think about. And the other, I will now immediately give the floor to our second discussant, Paola Maieri, Program Coordinator of Migration Response at the Italian Red Cross. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you all. I'm Paola Maieri and I work from Italian Red Cross. So I give you a snapshot of what's going on in Italy. Because as you know, Italian Red Cross is fully engaged in search and rescue operations and in the hosting also irregular migrants, because we are talking always about irregular migration flows. So I tell you, so 16, 17, we adapted to the crisis of 180,000 people coming to our coast. And slowly this number has not slowly, through new regulation and national government's policies to a very slim number, until now that in 2021, we are focusing and we are assisting an increase of number of arrivals. First of all, the crisis is in just in the reception modalities, because we do have less reception post for them now. We have less reception. But actually, as Professor Singleton was saying, this cannot be considered a crisis because we know that people are in movement. And I thank you also the other panelists to have shed the light on the missing persons. As you know, we have a platform on IOM on missing person in the central and in the Mediterranean as such, but we don't have numbers of how many people are dying during the road. Let's think about from Sierra Leone, from Nigeria until until reaching Libya. Okay, also in the desert of Libya, I'm sure that still people are missing. So this number is completely unknown. So the crisis, where is the crisis if the people that we are rescuing and that we are hosting in our country actually could be, 80% of the people that really have left their countries for a better living. So I want also to share with you our participation in ITFLOWS. So I recall back our engagement in the project. We are a part of a very interesting exercise, and at the same time, it could be a very good result for learning of you frozen. Yeah, still hear me? No.
Yes, yes, we can hear you. It was frozen for just a second, but it should. It seems working now.
Yeah.
Okay?
So we are creating together with other Migratool. Migratool has first of all, we assume that will you have shown today to the audience, because it will not serve as you know, just to reflect how many people are coming in Italy from 2016 until now, but I have a very few data on how many people are coming next year, even though from now I can presume that people are reinforced the other routes to arrive to Italy or to Europe. So the tool has an objective to predict some of this movement, also considering not only, as you said, crisis spots, such as triggered by violence or armed conflict, but also we would like to feature in this and embed in this tool also movement caused by climate, because this is what we think will be affecting in the next years. So just briefly, the tool is but the value contribution that civil society is giving to this tool is actually the composition of a users board. So the users board will validate in each step the tool, and it's composed by civil society organization and especially municipalities. Today in the discussion, very few, let's say, view have been taken from that they know perfectly what's going on in their context, and they have really good information on actually what's going on. So the composition of this team is related to the fact that, for example, Italian Red Cross has been called as the first. We follow the disembarkations, then we have NGOs from across Greece, Spain that are on the second reception step, and then of course we have municipalities. So the bottom-up approach for sure will give us a better also on the movement of the people. In fact, in the next step also this realization of this tool, we would like to include migration-led associations, because we presume that they are the ones that are holding most of the information about they are willing to take a migratory path. So this tool will intend for sure to understand what are the increase or decrease of migration flow, will serve to allocate proper resources, maybe to have a preparedness plan, because at this stage we can really have some information to adapt quickly to the new circumstances caused by a so-called crisis or anyhow a migration movement. We would like also to, thanks to the tool, to have a localized tailored response. So that's why the municipalities are welcome to contribute to the validation of the tool. And the tool will also serve to raise awareness about the potential of the migrants, and also to diffuse tensions between the host community and the migrants. I think that's from my side. It's all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Many thanks, Paola. Indeed, we had some small issues with the connection, but I hope the audience was able to follow your presentation and your very interesting account of the activities also that Red Cross is doing in Italy, and specifically in the context of ITFLOWS. So many thanks again. And I think it's now time to turn to our interactive discussions. We have some questions, so I would from the audience. So I would like to give the possibility to our speakers to answer these questions, and also to when they do so, also to address any issues that were that was raised by our discussants. So I would start with Mr. Buzakiewicz. We have two questions that I think they are specifically addressed to you. One from Gabriele De Luca. I allow myself to cut a bit this question to summarize the content of this question, and the question refers to problems concerning our poor understanding of how migration function and how it influences it, and how to influence it in the direction that we desire. For example, when we write computer simulation, we have about migration, we have perfect information on anything we want, but even in that case, non-linear and chaotic effects make prediction not only hard, but provably impossible outside of a very short time range in the near future. So I guess the question would be, how do you consider these specific challenges that are related to models for predicting, anticipating migration? And then there is another question from Lina Vosiliute from SEPS. And the question is whether the Belarus, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia situation qualifies as a crisis, and what precisely the crisis is about. And then if the Commission is prepared to scrutinize any intentional negligence or non-preparation by member states and to ascertain if that is at the heart of the crisis. So these are the two questions from to Mr. Pablo Shakib. I give you the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much also for all the speakers and discussants for the points that were very interesting for our work, definitely. Now, addressing the questions, although the first question seems to be pretty complex, but I will try at least to address it as much as I understand it. I mean, in my understanding, and I had pleasure to spend in the area quite some time already. I think that we do have, and Professor Singleton also referred to that, we do have knowledge about a lot of factors which drive migration. And I'm not sure whether we should say that we would not know them or we do not understand them. Now the problem is in terms of how do we interpret them and what conclusions do we draw from them. That's one thing. The other thing is that if we then try to extrapolate from, even if we understand them correctly, we will try to extrapolate from that understanding the possible forecast or whatever early warning. We need to remember that there is simply life factor and human factor involved, and nowadays, especially with social media and the speed of information, those things then they can vary tremendously, and as much as we would invest in understanding the underlying factors, it's difficult really to say and put a finger of, okay, now we should expect as many. So voila, that's as much as I tried to reply to the first question. For the second question, I mean, to what extent we treat the Belarus situation as a crisis? I mean, we spoke a lot about crisis in general, and quantitatively, I mean, when we see it in terms of arrivals, we do not consider that we are in the crisis now, migratory crisis across Europe. We do have certain pressures at certain borders, but we do not consider that we are under migratory crisis. Now, the situation for Belarus, actually, in terms of numbers of people who manage to cross the border, is not really to be treated as migratory crisis. However, it's a crisis. It's of a different type. I mean, you want to call it, hybrid, you want to call it a political crisis, there might be a lot of brands for that, but it is a crisis, and it's a type of crisis that we haven't had really occasion so far to confront. Voila, it is a crisis, maybe not necessarily kind of quantitative migratory crisis, but it has definitely migration implications and implications for the people who are definitely victims of that situation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this feedback. I turn now to Anne Singleton. We have a question also from the audience for you, Anne, from Hermione Santopolo, and she says what we face is thanks a lot for your intervention. We face a crisis of EU law and not a crisis. What we face, she says, is a crisis of EU law and a crisis of implementation of human rights rather than a migration crisis. Do you think that modeling and predicting could work for the benefit of people on the move if we change our premise as to what crisis entails? So that would be the question from our audience to you, Anne.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm not arguing that we should stop trying to build scenarios or predict, but I'm saying it's not possible to do that in a way that actively can inform considered decisions without another policy framework within which to do that. And I think the narrative is very important. The way in which the situation is seen and analysed is very important. And I come from, before I worked in migration statistics, I came from a background of peacetime emergency planning, and I dealt with evidence based on and investigations on a lot of peacetime emergencies and disasters in the UK, which resulted from ineffective public safety planning, the demolition or removal of health and safety responsibilities from public authorities in the era of kind of privatization of many public functions, and there became like a hole within which safety fell. And I think a lot of what happened has informed my thinking about the way in which migration policies are seen as crisis. I think that the disasters that I worked with and the survivors, the people that I spoke with then, very much resonate with what I've learned from working with survivors from the shipwrecks and from the journeys, is that the response to their situation is being seen as an issue about public order or security or control, instead of being an issue of public safety. So if the preparations for the future involved scenario building that said, what would we do if human beings were in danger of losing their lives, and the planning was directed towards human safety and public safety, then the response might actually help to dissipate what is seen as a crisis now, instead of exacerbating it. So my argument would be, yes, to factor in different assumptions into the modelling, but base the aim of the exercise on creating a more humane society for everyone to live in. And so those priorities would be part of your scenario building. And then so you move from a defensive or kind of security mindset to a public safety mindset. I think that would be helpful. Now, I'm not arguing that you don't need security and some element of planning around risk that is perceived as being risks at the border, but that should be around safety and the safety of personnel, as well as people trying to cross the border. So I think that whole shift in how you think about a situation could help to bring the EU to a much more positive place, and it could reduce many of the numbers of deaths that are happening. So that would be my answer to don't remove the aim to have scenario building, but build different assumptions and different aims into the point of the exercise.
Thanks a lot, Anne, for this further input to this discussion. I turn now to Giuseppe. Giuseppe, there is a question for you from Yasha Mecanico. It's related to your final part of your intervention, and it says, would you extend it to convey the idea that the system and this proposal are geared precisely at multiplying the number of criteria that can lead to a situation being described, certified, and consequently acted upon using extraordinary or solutions that go beyond the limits to what states are supposedly allowed to do? So that's the question from the audience. Giuseppe.
Well, thank you, Roberto, and thanks to Yasha Mecanico for the question. Oh, yes, in many ways I agree, and this points to what I was saying, that very often crises are manufactured by state policies. We had an example, a clear example here back in 2011, at the time of the Northern African emergency, how it was called in Italy. That was clearly a manufactured crisis by the Italian government of the time, and then by using a crisis argument, the aim was to gain support from EU institutions. So, if we forget that very often migratory crisis or humanitarian crisis, I mean, are the outcome of policy decisions, we miss a very important point here. Also, I agree with what Professor Sigurd, and again, I have to agree with her, what she was saying about, the main rationale behind the actual crisis response mechanisms, which seems to me mostly the controlling migration, regulating and limiting migrants' movement. This is we don't know how the Commission will use the new instruments in the future, but what we know about how existing instruments works, if we take, for instance, the definition of crisis in the Frontex regulation, it is clearly targeted at border security. If you read the Frontex regulation, a crisis can be declared when a critical level to a section of the border, for instance, can be attributed when the member in that section of the border there are disproportionate challenges related to illegal immigration, which may have an impact on border security. So clearly the aim, even though Frontex has a mandate also for saving lives, it's a coast guard in its very name. So they should have a humanitarian mandate, but it defines security. But also, if you take the CIRM, the manuals, the official manuals for assessing and evaluating risks at the borders, clearly it is a security-oriented definition of crisis. But I have concerns also with regard to the definition of crisis included in the proposal for the EU Asylum Agency. There, if you take the proposal, you see that a crisis may be declared, and so the Asylum Agency may step in and offering operational support to a member state when that member state face a disproportionate pressure, placing exceptionally heavy and urgent demands and putting in danger or at risk of having serious consequences for the functioning of the common European asylum system. What does it mean, the functioning of the common asylum system? Does it mean that all migrants are registered and kept at the border? Or does it mean that the asylum system is ready to offer protection to all incoming asylum seekers? I mean, it's a vague notion, which you have the very same definition of crisis, for instance, with a reference to the functioning of a common asylum system, also in the Pact. The crisis situation is defined in that way. in the pact. So again, I see behind these very definitions that the main political rationale is controlling migration, not the human security of migrants and asylum seekers.
Thanks a lot, Giuseppe. Thanks a lot for this additional point. We have another questions, and I would probably, if they agree, involve our discussion on it, also to give them the possibility to have a final reaction to what was said before giving the floor to Sergio for his conclusions. Joseph Ikari, the question is, does not Poland have as much right to build walls and fences at its borders as Spain to build walls and fences at the borders of Ceuta and Melilla? So it's a very direct question. I would like to ask Annalise if she has any feedback on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I would agree here with a statement the EU Commissioner and I suppose others made, that building walls is not a response to migration governance. So that is so far also the official line of the EU. I'm not sure this is going to stay like that, but this is certainly how we would continue to see it. Now, what is key is that beyond the rhetoric of building walls is that what is preserved is the right to access territory in accordance with international human rights and refugee law obligations. This is what ultimately matters. If states want to construct their fences and walls, there need to be access points. That's what is fundamental. There needs to be a way for people to gain access and to make rightful asylum claims. And so that is basically what is key in preserving our fundamental rights framework, and particularly in upholding one of the core principles of international protection, which is the principle of non-refoulement, which we see threatened in ways that we haven't seen before. We are very worried, particularly by the trend, which does seem to go unchallenged or not too vocally challenged, of amendments in national legislations, which alongside construction of borders, obviously also try to already put in place a sort of legal framework which makes claiming asylum virtually impossible and legally impossible, and also leads to what is then a sort of legitimization of pushback policies. This is something that needs to be challenged by the Commission in the first place, as guardian of the treaties, and on which we would like to understand what type of dialogue is going on with relevant states at external borders, and whether, this is going to, particularly, what we wouldn't like to see is this type of legal framework that is being put in place is then not replicated or even lead to a certain level of codification in EU instruments as well. So this is what we are going to monitor and try to push back on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I would like to ask Paola Maiedi if she has any additional remarks based on the last questions of interventions.
But actually, I mean, as the Italian Red Cross has a paramount objective to against, I mean, of course, any walls, but we are also on the firm stance that, I mean, the freedom of movement of migrants should be respected. And finally, we really believe also that the ongoing search and rescue operation are saving very vulnerable people. We don't forget that the people are coming now are not numbers. Today we didn't really talk about vulnerabilities. So the crisis should also be reflected, not about people coming, but what kind of population we are. So, and we are facing an increase of vulnerability that will actually, if we don't react before they're coming, here it will have a lots of impact and consequences, because the level of traumatization of people from Libya is very high. So we need to promptly respond to their needs. We don't have to cover our heads. And you know, with a sufficient response, I think we also we like to see this both people and this very journey to finish very soon. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Thanks a lot for this. I think I now give the floor to. Time is the time allocated is running out, so I would like to give the floor to Sergio Carrera for his concluding remarks on today's very rich discussion. Sergio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you to all the panelists for their excellent contributions and presentations, and to all of you who are still with us, watching us, and who are participating in this conversation by raising very pertinent questions. Now, you know, if anything I've taken out of this conversation is the emphasis that many of you have put in the need of humanizing the conversation, really humanizing the conversation, bringing the invisible to light. What Paola mentioned, people are not numbers, and Singleton's call for really shedding light on the impact of certain policies on people, the invisible. So for me, that's been a very consistent message. But also for a project like ITFLOWS and the tool that Paola mentioned, about the need to take in, and also in current policy developments, the blueprints in particular, to take in the role of policies, the role of policy instruments, of policy decisions in co-creating crisis and irregularity. This has been also quite common finding in the conversation, which reflects the state-of-the-art literature, academic literature, emphasizing this. So the focus in curtailing, as Annalise Baldacchini was advancing, curtailing arrivals at all costs and reducing the number of entries, and how certain governments' decisions focused on containment. You know, what happens in practice? How do they manufacture you know, emergencies? Also so important to take in our thinking and ways of doing things, both in the field of research, civil society, but also policy making. Now, all of you have raised, I think, very important issues in terms of methodology. And many of you actually have said quite clearly, it's not possible to predict. You know, it's not possible. Yeah, we need to take into account the policy framings that steer these kind of initiatives. And what I think I found very interesting from Pablo also, not only include the EU, there is this idea that everyone is coming to the EU, that everybody wants to come to the EU. And in fact, the evidence is telling us that this is not true. The big majority of people looking for international protection are not coming to the EU, are not arriving to the European Union. They are in fact internally displaced in their country of origin or in the neighboring countries. So this idea of arrows coming to the EU and flows coming to the EU is completely unrealistic. and it just lives in the minds of some people, but it is not factual. So bringing in order to ensure the proportionality of the assessment, of the situation, what is happening in non-European countries is absolutely crucial. Now, we've discussed at length on what constitutes or not crisis, and I found Giuseppe's presentation really excellent in identifying the existing possibilities there. What is clear is about when something, a phenomenon is declared, politically declared as crisis, there are clear consequences or effects. We are seeing those that focus on derogations and restrictive responses, derogating really fundamental rule of law guarantees to people, including effective remedies, access to asylum. And I think there's been a common understanding here, this is rather problematic to live up to EU's values. But there are also other options laid down by López Aguilar also in his intervention. So triggering solidarity, hopefully following Anne's call, not only interstate solidarity, but individuals, solidarity towards individuals, the prima facie recognition or immediate protection initiatives have been highlighted as important there. But I mean, let's be also quite honest and clear. The fact that certain governments at the moment in the current, controversy with Belarus regime are systematically engaging in policies that contravene current EU law provisions and obligations in a very open way. Issues like not allowing people to access asylum procedures, exposing them to risk of chain refoulement, endangering right to life, as we've seen, many people losing their lives in this process, and access to justice are clearly in violation. Clearly, there's absolutely no doubt, not only of international commitments, but also EU law. I mean, I'm thinking of the Schengen Borders Code, I'm thinking of the Asylum Procedures Directive, effective access to procedures, allowing people to have access to international protection. And this is all being fundamentally undermined in a situation that is being framed as a state of emergency and is actually raising many rule of law issues, not only for people at hand, but also for the role of civil society who want to monitor the situation, rightly so, but also ensure legal assistance and legal aid to those people. But also journalists, media monitoring of what is happening at the borders. Someone mentioned that the question of the border fencing. I couldn't agree more with Annalise's point. The current Spanish practice of border fence is a specific domestic and national issue, which is actually finding way in national courts and European courts. And it would be indeed very unwise for the EU to put an EU logo into a practice that actually puts and jeopardizes very fundamentally EU standards and guarantees enshrined in asylum law and borders law. So it's something that needs to be kept in mind. And my last point is that if the focus is then on instruments and policies, or should be on instruments and policies, the lack of genuine and effective access to the European Union, means of legal entry, there is a lack of genuine and effective ways for people to make it legally. This has been corroborated by all the research, academic knowledge, civil society evidence. How can people make it? I mean, we come back to the question of how certain policies co-create irregularity and dehumanize also the internationally recognized right for people to search for international protection elsewhere, which, by the way, is being undermined by some EU initiatives to curtail airline companies to bring people to Europe from countries that clearly are refugee-producing countries or countries whose nationals do have a legitimate right to international protection elsewhere. So these are all elements that certainly we are taking careful note on everything you shared during this panel. It will certainly inform, and it is informing as we speak, the ITFLOWS project. And I can only thank you for that. And just to also thank Roberto. Perhaps, Roberto, you can close the panel.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Sergio, for your interventions, for pointing to such these very relevant issues that will, as you said, we will continue to focus on it and develop on this in the following period. So I would like to, let me close by thanking all our panelists for their valuable contributions. Thanks very much to all the participants for being with us in this webinar and for actively contributing to the discussions, for their questions. Final thank also to colleagues at CEPS for their support in running this webinar. I would like to wish you a good continuation of the day and remind you to follow ITFLOWS on our website, on social channels. There is much more to come in the next future in terms of events and publications. So stay tuned. And with that, I thank you again and all the best.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.